Thanks so much. Wow, this is great. You know, when we launched this book a year and a half ago, we had a book launch celebration at University Bookstore in Seattle, which is sort of ground zero for this story. And we had a great event. We had, I think, 400 people there. But then I got on a plane the next day and began the actual book tour, and I flew to Chicago. And somebody drove me about half an hour or so outside of Chicago to a suburban bookstore. And I walked in and there were 3 people there. So when you do this, you have to get used to a certain amount of humility. You know, very quickly after that, the crowds began to grow. It takes a while for a book to, to get going. Certainly nobody had ever heard of me or the book at that point, so I'm surprised that the 3 showed up, actually. But thank you so much. It is particularly fun to talk about this book here in the area, because I know that there are always people in the audience who knew one of these guys, or who rode at UW during those years, or close to it, or knew one of the coaches, and it's a lot of fun for me to hear from people that have connections with the story. So this is a story, of course, that culminates at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And I always like to start by acknowledging that I think when you first hear the phrase 1936 Berlin Olympics, the first thing that comes to most people's mind is, of course, the Jesse Owens story. And rightly so. The Jesse Owens story is one of those great American stories that we tell and retell, we tell our children, we put in our school books, because it's one of those stories that helps define who we are as a people. I think this story of these 9 kids from around here, from Western Washington, who got on the same boat as Jesse Owens that summer and went to Berlin, I think their story is another story that helps remind us of who we are and what we value. The Jesse Owens story reminds us about our passion for equality and fairness and a level playing field and great individual achievements. The story of these kids from Washington, it differs in one important way. It's not a story of great individual achievement. It's a story of a great team achievement. And I think it helps remind us that historically, at least, we've been a people who have been pretty good at building great teams and getting things done. Although I'm not sure that's as true today as it once was, and I'd like to come back to that theme towards the end. First though, let me talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, because I really think that is so essential to what the book is at its heart. I live over in King County, east of Redmond, out in sort of semi-rural King County. And although it is a semi-rural neighborhood, we have this hideous thing called a homeowners association. And that compels us to get together once a year and argue about things. Weighty things like what color you may or may not paint your mailbox and things like that. And every year we get into these great tussles over all kinds of silly things. But I don't know, you may like your homeowners association. Sorry, I'm going to offend you if you do, but I don't much like mine. But I am grateful to it for one thing in particular. It was at one of those meetings 6 years ago, after one of those meetings, that my neighbor, a lady I knew then only as Judy, came up to me and introduced herself. And she said that she was reading one of my earlier books to her father. And her father was in the last couple months of his life living under hospice care at her home. And he was enjoying that book, and so Judy wondered if I would come down to meet him. And so I think it was the next day, I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was stretched out on a recliner. He was very weak, he was on oxygen, but he was very alert mentally. And I sat down and we talked a little bit about that earlier book, but very quickly the conversation turned to his childhood growing up during the Depression. And if you've read the book, you know he had a very difficult family situation that he had to overcome early in the Depression. And that in itself really got to me and became an important part of the book. But He quite quickly then moved on and started talking about how he had come to row crew at the University of Washington starting in 1933, and how over the next 3 years that had begun to redeem his life and change him, and how ultimately he and his crewmates had rowed against a German boat, amongst others, in front of Hitler at the Berlin Olympics. And as Joe was telling me this, I was absolutely mesmerized. My jaw probably literally dropped. I just remember sitting next to him, shaking my head. But I noticed that, from time to time he was struggling to hold back tears. And I noticed that he was struggling to hold back tears, particularly whenever he talked about any of the other fellows in the boat. And at first I thought he was crying for the loss of them. Most of them had passed away in the preceding few years. But the more he talked, and he talked about rowing with these guys, I began to see there was an enormous amount of joy and pride in those tears, and that it wasn't just mournful or sadness that was at work in Joe that day. And as he talked some more, I began to realize that he used the phrase, the boat. He said, actually what happened was, I said, towards the end, I put it the wrong way. I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And he immediately shook his head no. Very gruffly said no. And he looked down, and then he looked up, he thought for a minute, and he looked up, and I remember this moment because there were, again, tears in his eyes. He looked up, and he said, but you could write a book about the boat. And I didn't know at first what he meant. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful cedar shell that he and the guys had rowed in. We talked a little more, and I began to understand that by the boat he meant, of course, the other guys in the boat. The other guys in the boat plus the boat. What they had all done together, but something even more than what they had all done together. He meant by the boat this almost perfect thing that they had all become together 75 years before in Berlin. This almost perfect thing. And that was behind those tears. And so that was the spirit in which I set out to write the book. And I began the next day, set out on a quest that actually wound up taking about 4 years to try to understand more deeply what was behind those tears. And that, of course, turned in eventually to the boys in the boat. Now, since the book's come out, I get emails every day from people all over the country, and actually from all over the world these days. And there's certain comments that come up over and over in these emails. And one of them is, and I hear this probably several times a day, and you see this in Amazon reviews too. Somebody says, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really what could possibly be more boring than a book about rowing. And fortunately they go on then to say, wow, I was really wrong. The book is about much more than rowing. I have to agree. 6 years ago, I probably would not have picked this book up, and I'm always kind of amazed that it has spread the way it has. I would have thought the same thing. But it does turn out, as I dug into this story and I embarked on that odyssey to find out what was behind Joe's tears, I discovered quite quickly that there was so much more to this story than just rowing. And we'll get back to rowing in a minute. But it turned out to be a big, epic, sweeping story about the human heart. It was a story about this one boy, Joe, who first learned that he couldn't trust anyone in the world except himself. Then learned that to get what he wanted out of life, he had to learn to trust others on a very deep level. It was a story about an almost mystical figure, a sage-like British-born boat builder named George Yeoman Pocock, and how he shaped the lives of these 9 young men. It was a story about a somewhat challenging man named Al Ulbrichtson, who had grown obsessed with realizing an Olympic dream. It was a love story. It was a story about grit and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, about psychological devastation and ultimate jubilation. It was a story about the American genius for defying long odds. It was about the cold realities of life in America during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. It was about Joseph Goebbels and Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl, about propaganda and deceit, about democratic values come face to face with fascist cynicism, and on that level it was pretty starkly a story of good and evil. But most of all, it was a story about these 9 very decent, hardworking young men who came together to forge something much larger than the sum of their parts. Now, that's not to say that rowing isn't central to the story. Rowing is really the stage on which a number of human dramas take place and play out. And actually, it turns out, as I say, I would not have been particularly interested 6 years ago. But over the last 6 years, I've become quite a fan of rowing. It turns out to be much more interesting than I would have thought. And I just want to tick through a few of the things that have stuck with me and made me a fan of the sport. One is simply the extreme physical challenge of this sport. There are very few things that human beings do that match rowing, particularly rowing at this level, at the Olympic level. They match it for the sheer output of energy and the extraordinary demands that it puts on the human body. A rowing coach once said that rowing a 2,000-meter race, Olympic race, is like playing 2 NBA basketball games back to back, but doing it all in about 6 minutes in terms of the physiological toll that it takes on the body. There's very few things that match rowing for the precision and the coordination and the timing and the synchronization. Another rowing coach said that putting 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row a 2,000-meter race is like putting them in front of 8 golf balls, 8 men or women in front of 8 golf balls, giving them golf clubs, and asking them to swing and to hit those balls at precisely the same moment with precisely the same amount of force, directing the balls in precisely the same direction. And then you do the same thing over and over every 2.5 or 3 seconds or so. Extraordinary amount of precision required. There's the incredible mental toughness of this sport. Those of you who row, I think, know what I'm talking about. Those of you who don't, if you ever drive across the floating bridge on Lake Washington on a cold winter day and look out towards the University of Washington, you'll probably see the men or the women or both out there rowing in January or February in sleet and snow and cold cutting winds. It's very hard to make yourself get up and do that day after day after day. For a sport that these days really there's very little in the way of personal glory attached to it. There's nothing at all in the way of monetary reward attached to it. So there's a lot of character and a lot of mental toughness. And as I've traveled around the country and met hundreds and hundreds of rowers in the last year and a half, I could tell you there's a certain kind of character that typifies rowers that I have come to admire a great deal. There's a long, colorful history and tradition associated with the sport. Rowing was actually the first intercollegiate sport in America. I think it was 1852, and I don't remember if Harvard challenged Yale or Yale challenged Harvard. One challenged the other to a boat race, and that was the first time 2 colleges in America ever met in any kind of athletic endeavor. There's the aesthetics of the sport, the beauty of a crew that has found its swing, and especially in these days when they rowed in these beautiful cedar shells out on a misty lake or misty river early in the morning, a crew that had its swing. It's a beautiful thing to behold. And there's a lot more drama in a crew race than may be obvious to someone watching casually from the shore. So much of the drama in a crew race takes place inside the boat. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to drop you down, put you in the boat so you could understand it. You know, I've watched crew races from the bank of the Montlake Cut or something like that. And to be perfectly honest, from that perspective, it's not always the most dramatic thing that you've ever seen in your life. But inside the boat, there's so much happening that if you can see it from that point of view, it's always exciting. And in the 1930s, a great deal of the drama in this sport came from the enormous crowds that the sport drew. It's hard to believe these days, but in the 1930s, 1920s really, and 30s and 40s, a rowing regatta would draw 80, 90, 100,000 people on a Saturday afternoon. And not just in Boston on the Charles River, but here on Lake Washington, down on the estuary in California, on the Great Lakes, a number of places around the country. Huge crowds would come out on Saturday afternoons to watch a race. There was national coast-to-coast radio broadcast of important races, and millions of people would tune in on the radio to listen to them. Prominent oarsmen would appear on the covers of Saturday Evening Post and other national magazines. A coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in the newspapers. And in Berlin in 1936 at the Olympics, actually the rowing regatta was the second most popular venue there, following only the track and field events in the big stadium that the Nazis built in Berlin. So I have a passage I'd like to read that sort of, I hope, illustrate the kind of atmosphere and the kind of drama inside the boat and outside the boat. But I'm going to pick it up in the middle of a race scene, and so I sort of need to set the scene for you before I begin. This race takes place in Poughkeepsie in June of 1936. This is the de facto national championship. There are about 100,000 people in Poughkeepsie that day to watch the race. Hundreds and hundreds of boats are on the Hudson River, everything from rowboats to a Navy destroyer, full of fans. There's an observation train that runs parallel to the river. There's a fellow up on the railroad bridge named Mike Bogo, whose job it is to set off a series of bombs, the number of bombs indicating the lane assignment of the winning boat. Now, to nourish their dream of going on to the Olympics that summer, these kids from Washington State really need to win this race. And in particular, they need to defeat their arch rivals from Cal Berkeley. Kai Ebright, the coach at Cal, has won 2 previous national championships, but more importantly, he has twice taken Cal to the Olympics and won gold medals. And Al Ulbrichtson, the Washington coach, is absolutely obsessed with preventing Kai Ebright from doing that this year and taking Washington instead to the Olympics. In fact, he has told his wife that if he can't go all the way to Berlin, he's done with coaching. So everything is on the line for Ulbrichtson with this race. The race goes off at about 6 p.m. as dusk is falling over the Hudson River. Ulbrichtsen's watching the race unfold from the press car on the observation train. I should tell you that if you haven't read it already, Ulbrichtsen is infamous for his reticence. He's often called the Dor Dane, or the man with the stone face. He does not like to betray emotion of any kind, particularly in front of his boys and in front of sports writers. Now, Ulbrichtsen has told Bobby Mock, his coxswain, to race from behind, but under no circumstances to get more than 2 lengths behind. But Bobby Mock, who I should tell you is not at all above lying to his crew about where they are in the field if he keeps them motivated. Bobby Mock has been holding his boat 4 lengths back for the first 3 miles of this 4-mile race, and Ulbrichtsen is becoming absolutely frantic. So I will pick it up from there. Let's see here. As the Washington boat swept under the black skeleton of the railroad bridge at the 3-mile mark, it was still nearly 3 lengths back with a mile to go. The leaders had slowed just a bit, and that had narrowed the gap. But if Mock had raised the rate at all, it was imperceptible. The Washington boys were rowing as if in a kind of trance now, somehow detached from themselves, yet keenly aware of one another's every minute motion. I'm going to start you back up a little here.
Under the bridge.
Yeah, as it swept under the bridge. All right. As the Washington boat swept under the black skeleton of the railroad bridge at the 3-mile mark, it was still nearly 3 miles back, with a mile to go. The leaders had slowed just a bit, and that had narrowed the gap. But if Mock had raised the rate at all, it was imperceptible. The Washington boys were rowing as if in a kind of trance now, somehow detached from themselves, yet keenly aware of one another's every minute motion. There was little sound out in the middle of the river, except for Mock's chanting, the rattle of oars in the oarlocks, their own deep rhythmic breathing, and their pulses pounding in their ears. There was almost no pain. In the number 5 seat, Stub McMillan realized with astonishment that he was still breathing through his nose after 3 full miles of rowing. On the train, Al Ulbrichtson had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish third." Ulbrichtson's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Ebright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichtson, it was his own coxswain, the short kid, with his own Phi Beta Kappa key, and now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtson." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then another lie. "Here's California. We're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly the Husky Clippers slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington's picking up." But a minute later someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish now, still in third place, still 2 lengths back. But they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now, he barked. Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him, just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver, then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. People in rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. On the float in front of Washington's shell house, Evander May Calamar, the crew's cook, waved a frying pan over her head, whooping and urging the boys on. In Washington's press car, pandemonium broke out. George Barnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brougham was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Only Al Ulbrichtson remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. Joe Williams of the World Telegram stole a glance at him and thought, "This guy has ice water in his veins." With the finish line looming ahead of him in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White suddenly had the sensation that they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1 where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on a radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood, except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought, the crew's old mantra running on through his mind like a river, hearing it over and over, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp Oxford accent. Mind in boat, mind in boat, mind in boat. Then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. By the time the two boats crossed the line, in the vast vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtsen's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his old fedora. George Farnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credentials from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtsen and her son Al Jr. pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. Up on the automobile bridge, Mike Bogo had the distinct pleasure of setting off 7 bombs in rapid succession, and in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtsen just sat there, staring into the darkness, as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." And then he elaborated, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." And, that's really the moment at which these guys knew how good they were. In some ways, I don't think they ever doubted from that moment on how good they were. The nature of that comeback was so stunning. From there, they went on to Princeton and fairly easily beat Cal again and all the other contenders and won the right to become Team USA and go on to Berlin. In a minute, we're going to show you a clip of that gold medal race in Berlin. But before we do, let me just remind you of what they were up against that day in Berlin. The American boat and the British boat had set the 2 fastest qualifying times. But they were mysteriously assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the widest part of the course. There was a very strong headwind blowing that day. It was a blustery, cold, raining on and off kind of day. And so those lanes were a terrible penalty, being out there exposed to the wind. Italy and Germany, the 2 fascist states, were assigned lanes 1 and 2, protected the entire length, essentially the entire length of the race course from those winds. The American stroke, Don Hume, the stroke is the guy that sits right in front of the coxswain and sets the rhythm for the whole boat, so he's absolutely critical. Don Hume had been ill on and off for weeks, and in the days leading up to the gold medal race, he'd been running a high fever and had been in bed. And only at the last minute, the other guys prevail upon Ulbrichtsen to let Don sit in the boat for the gold medal race. But he was very, very sick as he climbed into the boat that day. There were about 75,000 fans there that day. Most of them were German, although there were Americans and Brits there. Hitler and Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring entered the regatta grounds as things were getting underway, dressed in dark capes. The crowd rose up and began to go Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. The Germans then proceeded to win the first 5 events that day, to win gold medals in the first 5 rowing events leading up towards the 8-horde race, which is always the prestige event. The crowd was getting more and more excited as the American boys paddled out to the start line. The crowd was chanting Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. They lined up at the at the starting line. The start was called, and because they were out in the windiest part of the course, they didn't hear when the start was called. They didn't know the race had begun until they saw the boats to one side lurch forward. They rowed out into the middle of the Langer See, this body of water they were rowing on. 1,000 meters down the course, they were tied with the Brits for dead last. Bobby Mock, the coxswain, was sitting in the coxswain seat, watching waves breaking over his bow and watching Germany and Italy streak down lanes 1 and 2 towards what seemed to be inevitable victories. But that's not the way it ended. And we're going to show you now the clip of the race. I should tell you that you don't actually see the American boat here until the very end of the race, and by that point the situation is very different than what I just described. Of course, there were no cameras in the boat the day of the race, if you were wondering. All the pulled back shots there, you really should listen to it with louder sound than that because the German voiceover is really compelling. But all the pullback shots were shot by Leni Riefenstahl the day of the race, or by her crew. She then prevailed upon the Americans, the Italians, and the Germans to re-row the next day, and she put cameras in the boats, right in the coxswain's face and in the rowers' faces, so that she then could intercut those close-up shots with the pulled-back shots. And Leni Riefenstahl the whole story, but it's a very good piece of film, the way she intercuts those close-ups, and she does it at a faster and faster rate as the race comes down towards the line. So I think it's a pretty amazing piece of film. Okay, now, along with the comments that I get all the time about how boring my book was supposed to be, there's 2 other comments that come up all the time. One of them is probably the most common comment I get. People every day tell me, and it's interesting because it's mostly men actually that tell me this, although I get a lot of women also, tell me that they just finished the book and they had tears in their eyes as they finished it. And the other comment is really interesting. I get people from both sides of our political spectrum, often very far to one side or the other of our political spectrum, and everywhere in between, who write to me and say, if only people on the other side would read this book, the world would be a much, much better place. And I think that's fascinating, because I didn't write this book with any political agenda in mind. These are such common reactions to the book, these powerful emotions, and the fact that it appeals to such a wide spectrum of people. I've been sort of thinking about that and trying to figure out why it is that that such a wide spectrum of people have such a strong reaction. I think part of it is just that I think people are seeing in this story things that we've lost somewhere along the way. And in particular, I think people are remembering a time when we were better able to come together and build great teams and get great things done together as teams. And I'm sure there's many other things at work too. But the other thing is, I think there are certain qualities to these boys, the boys themselves, that manage to appeal to us regardless of our political philosophy in life. There are certain qualities that we all seem to be able to identify with and to appreciate in these 9 young men. And so I just want to tick through what I think are the most important qualities of them, sort of hallmarks that defined these young men and made them what what they were. First, I think it's really easy to identify with the boys themselves because of their humble origins. These were guys, these were young men who grew up, as they say, around here in western Washington. They grew up on dairy farms and in mill towns. They grew strong wielding axes and pitchforks and hay scythes. To get where they wanted to go in life, they had to go up against and defeat first their very good rivals at Cal Berkeley, but then they had to go up and defeat kids who were very different than them, kids who were from the Ivy League schools, kids who had learned in many cases to row in prep schools, kids whose fathers were often titans of industry or U.S. senators or even presidents of the United States. Two of FDR's sons rowed at the same time. Then they had to go on and they had to go up against and defeat kids who, from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, kids rowing for Leander Club, kids who were in some cases literally aristocrats. Then they had to go up and against and defeat literally a hand-picked Nazi crew. So what I'm saying is they were classic American underdogs. They're the kind of everyday Joe that Americans tend to like to identify with. And they really were. You know, as a side, I just have to say, when I started working on this book, I committed to it the day I met Joe, and I knew Joe was a great guy. The next day it occurred to me that I didn't know anything about the other 8 guys. For all I knew, this was going to be a book about Joe and 8 jerks in a boat. And I was really relieved as I got to know each of them to find that they all had interesting backstories and they all really were the kind of young men that you would like to know yourself. Second, I think it's hard not to admire their extraordinary perseverance. They were extraordinarily tough and resilient, both physically and mentally. The kids that made it into that boat that went to Berlin that summer were the end product of a process that whittled down hundreds of kids between 1933 and 1936 to the 9 who were able to go to Berlin. They were the ones that hung in there day after day, week after week, year after year, as I say, out there in Lake Washington, rowing in the sleet and the wind, coming back for more over and over again. They were the ones who put up with Ulbrichtsen's very stern demands. So they were perseverant. Third, they were extraordinarily earnest. They believed that what they were doing was important. They had a deep pride in representing their country when they went to Berlin, of course, but there was more going on than that. And I just have to take a moment to talk about George Pocock in order to explain this. If you haven't read the book, George Yeoman Pocock was this British-born boat builder who grew up apprenticed to his father in the boat shop at Eton College outside of London, and then emigrated to Canada and wound up at the University of Washington building these beautiful handcrafted cedar shells. And the thing about Pocock is that he was the consummate craftsman. He believed that when he built a boat, he should leave a piece of his heart in every boat that he built. He was also a very good oarsman, and he taught these boys to row to win their races, of course, but more than that, to approach their rowing the way he approached the building of his boats, to approach it as a craft, and that they should leave a piece of their heart in every race that they rowed. And he taught that by doing that, they were elevating themselves. They were bringing themselves literally closer to God. Pocock was also a very spiritual man, and he thought there was a spiritual element to rowing, that they could make themselves part of something bigger and more important than themselves by rowing as nearly perfectly as they could. Every chapter in the book starts with a quote from Pocock because I really wanted his spirit to sort of infuse the book. And I'll just read one of them. It's sort of typical of all of them. He said, "It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you're rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine. The fourth thing that I think stands as a hallmark that we can all admire in these young men and that made them what they were was their extraordinary level of mutual trust and respect. Rowing is a sport that requires trust in a way that very few other human endeavors do. From the moment you climb into one of these 24-inch wide shells and try to row with an oar as long as one of these, everything is challenging. Keeping the boat upright is challenging. And the only way it gets done is if everybody in the boat is doing his or her part every single moment they're in the boat. So rowing demands an extraordinary amount of trust. You also have to remember that when you're rowing in an 8-oared shell, you can't see where you're going. You're throwing yourself into an unseen future. You're facing away from the direction that you're rowing. You're trusting everybody else in the boat to get their oar into the water precisely the right moment, get their oar out of the water at precisely the right moment, to apply precisely the amount of pressure to that oar. So I just can't emphasize enough how much trust is essential to the actual physical aspects of rowing. It's also, if you have read the book, you know that trust is really at the heart of Joe Rance's personal story. Joe, early on, as I said earlier, felt that he couldn't trust anyone in life except himself. He could only trust himself. When he showed up at Washington, and for the first couple of years he was there, he really wasn't as good an oarsman as he could become because he didn't really trust anybody else in the boat. He kept trying to row the boat across the line all by himself, and that's just not how crew works. It was only when Pocock got a hold of him and taught him to open his heart to the other guys in the boat that he began to become as great as he ultimately did. But it really goes beyond Joe. These 9 guys, over the 3 years they were together, they forged these bonds of trust and affection that is very hard to overstate. But one way to sort of get at it, I had a chance to see the diaries and letters that many of them wrote just before the big gold medal race in Berlin. And the thing that comes up over and over in those is that they all were afraid of one thing. They were all afraid they'd let the other guys in the boat down. That was what was important to them. They didn't want to let those other guys down. And I should say these guys maintained that kind of trust and bond until literally the end of their lives. It was very touching as I saw the last couple of them as old men. Finally, the least obvious but perhaps most important hallmark or factor, I think, in the success that these guys met and the reason that so many people are drawn to their story is this. Each one of them had a measure of humility to him. I mean, make no mistake, these were big, tough, strong guys. They had healthy egos. It's a fairly audacious thing to get in a shell and row at all. It's a very audacious thing to think you're going to do it at the Olympic level. So they all had good, healthy, strong egos. But over the 3 years they were together, rowing out there in the wind and the rain, having Olbison bark at them all the time, never knowing whether they were in the boat or out of the boat, it took a toll on them, but it humbled them. It taught them a measure of humility. It taught them that they needed one another and that there were things they could do better together than they could do individually. And I think that humility that they acquired was the gateway through which they were able to approach one another and open their hearts to one another and start building those bonds of trust that I was just talking about. And I should mention that these guys, they maintain that humility for the rest of their lives. For the most part, these guys came home and they put their gold medals in their sock drawers and they closed their sock drawers. And some of them never told their kids till they were adults that they had ever been in the Olympics, let alone that they had won a gold medal. I meet people all the time who worked with one or another of these guys and never heard about the Olympics at all. The exception to that was Bobby Mock. But that was sort of his role in life. Bob spent the rest of his life, understandably, promoting the crew and trying to get the crew into the Hall of Fame and trying to get publicity for the crew. So I'm going to conclude by saying that when I stand back from this story and contemplated what it means for me, and I really didn't think in these terms as I was writing it. In fact, I didn't think about this until after it was off to the printer. But at that point, I stood back from it and I said, all right, Dan, what does this really mean to you, this story of these guys? And it came to me as sort of a flash. I think this story of these 9 young Americans who climbed in a boat together and learned to pull together so powerfully and so beautifully. I think it's an almost perfect metaphor for what that generation of Americans did. I'm talking about the generation that for me is my father and my mother and my uncles and my aunts, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. That generation, beginning in 1929, the fall of 1929, they found themselves in the same boat as when the Depression happened. Everyone in this country pretty much experienced the travails of the Depression and learned a certain amount of humility at the hands of the Depression. And I think that, like these boys, that experience had a humbling experience that allowed them to come together and get things done, work together. You know, that's the generation that they built the great monuments like the Grand Coulee Dam. They won World War II on not one, but on 2 different fronts. After the war, they built the most prosperous era in our history. So I'm a huge admirer of that generation, and for me, that's what the book actually winds up being all about in its most fundamental level. So I'd like to close by reading just 2 paragraphs from the end of the book, or maybe it's 3, a couple paragraphs from the end. Before I wrote the last few chapters about what happened in Berlin, I wanted to go to Berlin and see the regatta course myself. So I went to this place called Grunau, south of Berlin, and the regatta grounds are still there. They were damaged when the Red Army came in and also by Allied bombing. But they've been rebuilt, and it's a beautiful regatta grounds now. It looks very much as it did in 1936. And while I was there, I had an opportunity to go up on the balcony where Hitler had stood and look out over the scene from there. And so I just want to read what was going through my mind as I was there that day. Let's see. I visited the Wassersports Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of Haus West. I stood there for a long, quiet minute, near where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer Sea, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, and his blades glinting, worked his way down the lanes towards the large Zeil sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the rest of the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw but did not recognize heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of Haus West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you.